Collective, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. Stop thinking they don't know better. They do. They just choose drama because it's familiar. And peace requires accountability. Devil reversed. They had every chance to break free, to unlearn the patterns, to stop blaming the world for the chaos they create. But that kind of freedom scares people who don't know who they are without dysfunction. Knight of Swords, they reckless with words, quick to fight, slow to reflect, always in a rush to prove a point, but never ready to prove they've changed. Four of Swords. Spirit says pull back, rest your mind. This is your confirmation. Their confusion was always calculated, and your silence is the loudest boundary you'll ever set. Spirit says let them sit in what they stirred up. You don't have to chase clarity when the chaos already gave you your answer. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Aries, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They keep spinning drama and calling it a misunderstanding. But Aries, you've already decoded the pattern. They thrive in messes because it lets them avoid accountability. And that's not where you're headed anymore. Devil reversed. They had the power to choose better, to grow, to unlearn, but they'd rather blame the flames than stop fanning them. Knight of Swords, they move off impulse, not intention. It's all fight, no reflection, all talk, no healing. And you've been dodging their sharp edges long enough. Four of Swords. Spirit says this pause is protection. You don't need to explain yourself again. Their chaos is not your clarity. And peace should never feel like a punishment. Spirit says you didn't walk away too soon. You walked away right on time. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Taurus, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They act unsure, but the patterns don't lie. Taurus, you gave them stability. They gave you storms. Devil reverse. They could have healed, could have unhooked themselves from the drama, but chaos is their comfort zone, and your peace makes them feel exposed. Knight of Swords, they rush to react but never sit with the truth. They come in hot but never stay long enough to grow roots. Four of Swords. Spirit says retreat. You've done enough. You've said enough. Now let your silence speak volumes. Spirit says the peace you're choosing now will protect the future version of you they were never ready for. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Gemini, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They act like they're lost. But Gemini, you see through the smoke screens. They create confusion to keep you close. But you're too clear now to play those games. Devil reversed. They had the tools to change, but they use them to manipulate. They're not trapped. They just love having an excuse to stay toxic. Knight of Swords. Every convo turns into a confrontation, and you're done being their emotional sparring partner. You want connection, not combat. Four of Swords. Spirit says protect your peace, block the bait, let your nervous system exhale, and let them chase their own chaos without dragging you into it. Spirit says they played confused because clarity would have exposed the truth. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Cancer, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They cried victim, but Cancer, you saw the cycle. They knew what they were doing. They just didn't think you'd finally be done. Devil reversed. They didn't want healing. They wanted control. And when they couldn't manipulate your love anymore, they flipped it and blamed you. Knight of Swords, fast talking, gaslighting, deflecting. Every apology came with conditions, and you're not negotiating your worth anymore. Four of Swords. Spirit says rest, let your heart breathe. You don't owe them access, especially not to the healed version of you. Spirit says what felt like chaos to them was just your clarity taken over. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Leo, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They turned every peaceful moment into a war. But Leo, your light exposed their shadows, and instead of healing, they chose to dim you down. Devil reversed. They could have met you in honesty, but they hid behind excuses because real love felt too vulnerable for someone who thrives in mess. Knight of Swords. Every time you tried to speak truth, they tried to outtalk you. Their ego couldn't handle your mirror, so they shattered the connection to protect their illusion. Four of Swords. Spirit says disconnect, let your roar rest, let silence be your strength now. Spirit says they weren't confused, they were committed to not changing. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Virgo. They're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They blame the circumstances, but Virgo, you saw the pattern. They chose drama over depth and excuses over evolution. The devil reversed. They had every opportunity to grow, but healing takes effort, and they're used to being rescued, not rebuilt. Knight of Swords. They attacked before they listened, defended before they understood, and you got tired of being misunderstood on purpose. Four of Swords. Spirit says step back, rest your spirit. You've already overextended. Now it's their turn to sit in what they created. Spirit says the closure is in the calm, not the chaos. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Libra. They're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They knew what they were doing, but pretended it was all miscommunication. Libra, you offered balance. They brought imbalance and blamed your boundaries. Devil reversed. They didn't want change. They wanted control. They acted stuck because freedom meant facing their own reflection. Knight of Swords. They were quick to argue, slow to reflect. Every conversation felt like a battle, and peace was never the goal. Four of Swords. Spirit says let it rest. You don't need to explain your healing or justify your absence. Distance is clarity. Spirit says their confusion was a cover, but your peace is your power. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Scorpio, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They tried to match your depth with dysfunction, but Scorpio, you saw through the act. They weren't looking for love. They were looking for control disguised as connection. Devil reversed. They wore their wounds like armor, refused to transform, and rejected every opportunity to break generational patterns. Knight of Swords. They chased every moment with anger and couldn't sit still in truth. Every time it got real, they ran or raged. Four of Swords. Spirit says pull your energy back, withdraw with grace. Their chaos is not your karma to carry. Spirit says you didn't abandon them. You released what was already draining you. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Sagittarius, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They said they didn't know what they wanted, but Sagittarius, you were clear from day one. They mistook your freedom for foolishness and your optimism for naivety. Devil reversed. They had choices but chose the cycle. They blamed the world for every downfall while repeating the same patterns with new faces. Knight of Swords. They moved fast, spoke reckless, never paused to consider your heart, only their hurt. Four of Swords. Spirit says rest. Let them sort their own storm. You're not their clarity coach. You're your own compass. Spirit says don't shrink just to stay in their storm. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Capricorn, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They acted like they didn't understand, but Capricorn, you gave them every map, every guide, every chance. They just didn't want to do the work. Devil reversed. They held on to their dysfunction like it was a badge, said healing was too hard, while making everyone else pay for their pain. Knight of Swords. They barked orders, pushed buttons, fought dirty, and you got tired of being their emotional punching bag. Four of Swords. Spirit says retreat. You've earned your peace. Let them argue with the wall because your energy is no longer available. Spirit says you weren't too much. You were too evolved for their chaos. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos, if this message is for you. Aquarius, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They knew what they were doing, but acted like everything was an accident. Aquarius, you brought logic. They brought confusion and called it passion. Devil reversed. They refused to break cycles because cycles let them feel powerful even when they were powerless. Knight of Swords. Every conversation turned chaotic. They couldn't handle your truth, so they twisted it and blamed you for their wounds. For Four of Swords. Spirit says detach, reboot your nervous system. You don't owe them closure, just distance. Spirit says the chaos wasn't love, it was avoidance in disguise. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos. If this message is for you, Pisces, they're not confused. They're just comfortable with chaos. They called you emotional, but Pisces, you were just tuned in. They couldn't handle being seen, so they created confusion to blur your clarity. Devil reversed. They had the chance to heal, but healing requires depth, and they were swimming in the shallow end while you were diving into truth. Knight of Swords. They talked loud but said nothing, argued just to win, not to understand. Four of Swords. Spirit says rest, close the portal. You don't need to reopen the wound to prove you've healed. Spirit says their drama doesn't deserve your compassion anymore. Comment, I've outgrown their chaos. If this message is for you.